is a former Massachusetts state trooper. He's a cop's cop, investigator for a Boston law firm for a time, an industrial photographer. But you gotta listen to this story. It's so cool. He's got his first novel out. I loved it, called The Rising at Roxbury Crossing. And I say first novel. It's, first of all, never too late to start writing novels.
That's right.
But Jim, you went to school a little bit later than some of the students go, right?
I did.
Tell me the story about how you got into writing novels here.
Well, after I retired from the state police and I took a position with Choate Hall and Stewart, I decided to scratch a cerebral itch that I had had since I was a young kid and never could find the time with raising family and whatever. And so I decided to go back to school, and the folks I was working with at the time suggested I'd go over to the Harvard Extension program. So I did, and took a course. The instructor, at the end of it, I sat down with him. I said, "What do you think?" And he said, "Man, you got to work at it, but go ahead. Yeah, keep going." So
keep going, kid.
Yeah, exactly. So knowing myself, I said, the only way I'm going to stick with this is I've got to get myself into some kind of organized program. So I decided to follow the graduate program over there. And 3.5 years later, I graduated with a degree in literature and creative writing.
Well, you've put it to good use. I just got the book recently, read it over about a 3-day period. It's called The Rising at Roxbury Crossing. And yes, it has to do with this part of the country. It's a historical fiction. It's a thriller. There's a sort of a mystery. You don't know what's going to happen until the very end. However, we do know that history occurred, and history that you write about in 1919 involves the city of Boston, the police strike, and much more. First of all, the inkling for the idea. You are a police officer, a state trooper. Was it something that, I know the answer to this, but you tell me, was it something that triggered this personal quest to write this novel?
Yeah. When I graduated with a degree, I started writing short stories. And I thought that's all I was going to do. Mm-hmm. And one day I was sitting with my father-in-law on the back porch, and he got talking about his life, and particularly his father, who he didn't know at all. He said that he had died when he was only 3 years of age.
Right.
So, one thing led to another, and he'd tell me what little he knew about him. And, oh, by the way, he was a Boston police officer. So I said to him, gee, would you want me to do a little research on that? And maybe I can find out a little bit more about him. And he said, yeah, could you do that? And I said, sure. So I made arrangements to meet with the archivist from the Boston Police, who at the time was Donna Wells, and gave her a slip of paper with his father's name on it. And a couple of minutes later, she comes out from the files, and she's holding an index card. And she says, oh, he was a striker. I grew up in Boston. I was born, raised, been associated with the city my entire life. Knew what the Boston police strike was, but didn't know a lot about it. So she started to bring out material that I read and whatnot, and particularly she had some material that she used to use when she was to give a lecture about the Boston police strike at the local branch libraries. And the more I read, the more I got hooked. And I said, I've got to write a story about this.
My guest here on The Jordan Rich Show is James Redfearn. And let me spell the last name. Now, this is a novel you want to pick up. It's his first one, and it's terrific. Redfearn. Barnes & Noble, Amazon. Ask your bookstore to carry it. First of all, Roxbury Crossing. Let's talk about that, okay? Because that plays a significant part in the book. Why that neighborhood? Why that area?
Well, that's my old home, as they say. I grew up over there in the Mission Hill area, and was very familiar with the streets and so forth. Was familiar with the old Boston Police Station 10 that was located right in the Roxbury Crossing. Right. And in reading the material from about the strike and the history of the time, so many of the events took place in or around or about Roxbury Crossing and Station 10. So it was just a natural for me.
Okay. 1919 is a very tumultuous year in world history. You have the end of World War I. You've got the decimation of the worldwide flu pandemic. You also have recently, and you mentioned this, you have in Boston the amazing, and I don't mean that in a good way, molasses explosion that killed a lot of people. And you have this political upheaval in the country involving anarchists, communists, socialists, Bolsheviks, and then you've got the trials and tribulations of the police. Now, before we talk about where the story goes, the police, up to this point, if we were to look at conditions that these guys worked under or the pay they were making, we would think insanity.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about what leads up to any organization like this wanting to strike. I mean, their conditions really are terrible.
Well, I think it revolves around a couple of things. One is the fact that was the trend in the labor movement at the time of the country, that labor realized that its greatest weapon was to strike. And so you had, in 1919, there were 3,600 labor strikes in the country, which is unbelievable. And every industry, every type of worker you can imagine went on strike. I don't think that was the original intent of the police. But they worked under really tough conditions. They worked under like a barrack system,
right? Like the firemen, but police would live together, and in not the fanciest of digs.
That's right. I mean, it was not unusual for four different officers to share the same bed in a 24-hour period. They earned approximately $1,200 a year. Early in 1919, they did get a $200 a year raise. Early in the spring, but it was so little, so late that it just couldn't keep up with the very high unemployment and high cost of living at that particular time.
Let's jump back into the novel because I want to highlight the fact that James has written this first one. It's a corker. I loved it. I've read a lot of Boston-based books. He's going to be right in here writing more, I know. You've got a young man from Ireland. It first starts in Ireland. Willie Dwyer, great character, young, tough, good cop, good guy. Yeah. Something happens in Ireland, he comes over here, and you've got this political sort of business environment where the police are struggling whether they want to go on strike or not, even amongst their own ranks. And you've got that combined with, you were able to combine the situation in Ireland. Right. What was happening in Ireland at that time?
Well, at that time it was the start of the Irish-Anglo War. It began in 1919 and went to 1921. It was a war that was, carried on by the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And if the readers or listeners have ever seen the movie Michael Collins, they'd understand that period. And it was a guerrilla war. It was nasty. A lot of assassinations, ambushes, and so forth. And what was interesting in the research that I did was how much it was supported by some Americans. There was a little bit of a division at the time. There were some who thought it was awful, wanted Ireland's independence, but didn't think that was the way to go about it. And then there were some who, a little more radical, that believed that was the only way that Ireland was eventually going to get its independence. And so it was promoted by Eamon de Valera, who ended up the first president of the Republic, who was actually an escaped prisoner at the time.
And he was in Boston.
He was in Boston.
And you point out that he had and there's a picture actually of him at Fenway Park.
Right.
With a huge crowd.
I've seen estimates anywhere between 40 and 60,000 people. And you can tell from the picture that there had to be something close to that because they were standing all over the infield, the outfield, and everywhere else. And basically what he was doing, he was trying to solicit financial support for the struggles, the troubles that's what they called it back then, and also political support for the new republic, which actually had not been accepted by the British government.
Well, all this is going on in Boston, the hot spot for Irish in America anyway, and you have Bolsheviks and actually anarchists blowing things up, and certainly Wall Street was the big Wall Street explosion. And so there's an air of fear in Boston at that time, right? People were frightened of terrorism, quite frankly.
Exactly. Yeah, they were. And although I think what history will support is that it wasn't as organized as maybe the media, kind of implied. But the bombings were real. There were bombings there was a May Day riots that occurred in several cities, including Boston, and as a result of the way they were put down by the police and the citizens, there were retaliatory bombings after that, including the Judge Hayden's home, the Attorney General of the United States, Palmer, and so forth. So there was some very real violence and destruction at the time.
We're talking with Jim Redfearn, his new book, The Rising at Roxbury Crossing, 1919 in Boston, and you've got a lot going on. And when we talk about the police, their job was to obviously keep the peace. And when you take the police out of that job because they're striking, things can happen, and things did happen. We'll talk about that a bit later in our chat with you, Jim. But I love the fact that we have real people, real characters mixing with fictional characters. And the real characters include the mayor of the city at that time, include the governor, who was Mr. Coolidge, who became president ultimately, and a guy named Curtis, who was the police commissioner. Now, before we get to Curtis, prior to him, there was a commissioner, right, who was a pretty decent guy, and the guys liked him. He was a cop's cop. What happened? He passed away suddenly?
Yes, he died of a heart attack in December of 1918.
And then Curtis is then appointed, and who appoints him, the governor?
At that time, it was the governor.
Yeah, wow.
Yes.
So this is a guy, tell us about Mr. Curtis, the commissioner.
Well, he's from an old Yankee family, and a gentleman that really relies on the rules and the enforcement of rules. And he was actually a mayor of the city in the late 1800s, and was considered a star on the Republican horizon. And after his first period as mayor, when he attempted to run for re-election, the local ward bosses, the Irish political organizers, organized against him. And they supported Josiah Quincy instead, and he lost the election. And because of that, he never forgave the Irish.
Right. Which meant most of his guys who were Irish, a lot of his guys who were Irish were going to feel the brunt of that.
Right.
So he was he a cop at any point in his career?
Not that I know of.
Okay,
no.
So he had no police training, unlike today where guys come up through the ranks and that's the way it should be.
Right.
So he's a pivotal player here. Who are some of the other players, not fictional, but real, that you were able to include? I mentioned Coolidge, of course.
Right. The governor, Calvin Coolidge, who actually rode this incident right to the White House. He was the governor at the time, and Andrew Peters was the mayor. Mm-hmm. And they're kind of interesting, those two characters, because they're really different people for all the quiet and reserved mannerisms of Coolidge. Peters is more kind of affable, flamboyant, and
the way a Boston mayor often is.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. There's this great stuff happening towards the end of the book when the strike is on, and they bring in. I guess you call them the guard, right?
Yes,
sort of the
state guard.
State guard at the time.
Right.
And Coolidge's cool, calm, collected approach, almost offhanded approach, and you can almost imagine him, the puppet master, pulling the strings, because everything had to do with image back then, right? I mean,
yes.
Public relations, and the PR for the police was not good when they went on strike.
That's right. Unfortunately, I think that they had a lot of support in the city, but once they went on strike and the riots occurred, they lost some of that support, and including the Irish community, the Catholic Church. I think they were, a little fearful to come out in support of them after what happened in the streets.
I suppose if the streets were quiet and the folks didn't rise up certain elements, it might not have been as serious, but it was pretty serious. People died during this time?
There were a couple of deaths.
Yeah.
Most of the damage was, and the problems were property.
Property,
damage,
right. We're going to continue talking with Jim about this amazing era in a book called The Rising at Roxbury Crossing, which is a work of fiction. I want to take a quick break, and come back following this and continue and talk further about what the newspapers were like, because in every chapter you've got actual newspaper accounts. My guest, James Redfearn, Redfearn, fascinating historical novel called The Rising at Roxbury Crossing, and we'll continue to take that trip down memory lane when we return here on The Jordan Rich Show. Welcome back. I'm Jordan, and you're tuned to The Jordan Rich Show. Don't forget, you can listen to us live at cbsboston.com anytime, BZ and CCO Radio. And we continue with Jim Redfearn, who's a first-time novelist after being a state trooper for many years and working in a lot of other jobs, always coming back to the idea of storytelling. And he's told a great, great story. We don't want to neglect the fact that you have an actual story running through this with fictional characters who are very, very intriguing. I mentioned Willie, but you also have a fascinating young lady who's a waitress, who's got some moxie, right?
Yeah, she certainly does.
And some of the friends that we hear about, some of the friends of Willie are pretty interesting as well. Yeah. Now, let's talk about some of the other operators, I should say. One of them is a guy who's, a state senator? You would think very pro-union and pro-labor. Right. He gets himself involved a little bit with some shady stuff and indiscretions, and then, like many politicians, he wavers. Yeah,
he does. That's Jim Rankin, and actually, Jim is actually based on an actual person, not the personal issues that he had, but the political, end of his life is similar, including the deal, so to speak, that he makes with Calvin Coolidge just before the strike.
And the deal is, I'm going to lay off and not support it as I might have.
Right. He's going to give him word of mouth only.
Word of mouth only, which means a lot.
Yeah, it
in
does.
That period.
Because if that union, which was the largest union in the city, had gone out on strike, then the police probably would have gotten everything they wanted, because it would have shut the city right down.
Samuel Gompers, who's a well-known union leader in American history, even came in and said, didn't he come in and say bad idea?
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he did.
Wow. So they were really left out in the cold.
Yeah, they were. They were. I think they were given a lot of lip service initially, and then when things turned bad in the streets, everybody, just kind of went off to their own little corner and waited for the dust to settle.
What did happen when the dust settled, Jim? I mean, obviously you've done all this great research, and the story takes us through sort of the strike itself, but what eventually happened to a lot of those guys? Lost their jobs, first of all.
They did.
Right.
Yeah, and I've seen different numbers, but it seems that somewhere around 1,100 to 1,150 patrolmen, and that's an important point to emphasize. This wasn't a patrolmen's union, so the upper officers and whatnot, they stayed on the job. They never left the job.
Brass was protected; they didn't leave the job. Yeah. And the guys they brought in, you mentioned the State Guard, which comparable maybe to the National Guard type thing. That's one thing, but didn't they also recruit? Because in the book you got some Harvard students. Did that actually happen?
Yeah, it did. Yeah, it did, including the football team that volunteered, and the then president of Harvard, Lawrence Lowell, actually kind of encouraged it, that they go over and perform a civic duty. That's what I think, and rightfully so. I think they were concerned with the possible damage and violence that could occur at the time.
Right. Tell you what, Jim Redfearn, you refer to them as coppers. They call themselves coppers.
Yeah, I think that's part of the heritage being brought over from Ireland and Europe,
right.
They did.
It's pretty interesting. Yeah. Now I want to talk to you about the newspapers, because in each chapter, what Jim has done is he's printed the headlines and the subheads for papers, most of them in Boston, but some of them from outside. And what it does is it gives us a look-see to what the media was talking about. And first of all, there were a lot of papers back then.
There were, well, Newspaper Row. I don't know how many Boston papers we had back then, maybe 20.
Something like that, because there's no TV or very little radio, obviously.
Right. And that's an important point, I think, to emphasize, is that the that the communications back then were basically between human beings. There wasn't the electronics of today. There wasn't television. I think radio was in its infancy. So when people wanted information, they went to other human beings, and oftentimes it was on the stoop or out on the street, and consequently, it took nothing for large crowds to develop out of nowhere.
There's one little piece here somewhere about a meeting that was supposed to take place at Symphony Hall about the League of Nations, which we remember was Wilson's big deal, and it had to be canceled because of the crowd, because of the mob scene.
Right.
So parts of the city, I don't think anybody escaped it, right? I mean, there were probably a few pockets that were safe, but most people were pretty frightened for a couple of days, I guess.
Yeah, they were. I mean, because the violence occurred both in the downtown area, but also in a number of the neighborhoods, like South Boston, Roxbury. I think East Boston had some problems, in Charlestown and whatnot, North End. So
now, we're not quite at Prohibition yet. However, you bring up Prohibition among certain groups, correct?
Right.
Who was prohibited from imbibing? Was it soldiers at that point?
Well, no, it actually was the country. The Prohibition movement had begun in the 1800s, part of the temperance movement, because many people back then, especially in the western part of the country, felt that the overindulgence in liquor was the cause of many of the social ills at the time. And up to that particular period, most of the solicitation for prohibition was coming from the western part of the country, in the western states, and the East was still like to go in and have a drink at the end of the day. But how the temperance movement was eventually able to sell it to the government was with the World War I, and it was an anti-German political move, actually, where they got the government to establish a wartime prohibition. So there was actually prohibition during the war.
That's what I meant. That's what I was referring to.
Yeah.
Because it's the Volstead Act, right?
Well, the Volstead Act, I think, was actually passed later in 1919, towards the end of 1919.
Okay, but because I'm also a big Boardwalk Empire fan, so I know that Prohibition was coming, but I thought it had not yet been officially the law of the land. So there's a lot of talk of it. I didn't realize that the war was really a high point.
Well, in the 18th Amendment was passed by Congress in I believe it was either early 1919 or late 1918, and then they had to be ratified.
By the states.
They had to go by the states. And as each state voted for it, they could accept the conditions of it immediately. So, in fact, Massachusetts on July 1st of 1919 had a prohibition law, but it wasn't enforced.
It was predating your story, which is September, I guess, right?
Yes.
September, right. So we're talking, again, the book is called The Rising at Roxbury Crossing. It's a novel. My favorite kind of novel is the historical fiction kind, because I love to read about the real people and how they interact with the fictional characters, and the fictional characters have a lot to do with the actual history, which is really cool. So you have all of this going on, and you also have international intrigue, because you have, and I won't give anything away here, but you have the British secret agent concerned about what De Valera is going to be doing, trying to subterfuge that whole thing. There's a lot of stuff going on in that period that people might scratch their heads and say, wait a minute, it seems like a simple time. We won the war, we come back, the roaring 20s, a lot of stuff underneath the surface.
Yeah, actually, and there was a lot of concern in the country at the time, because there was a little bit of, dispirited feeling amongst Americans at the time, because when all was said and done, they ended up with, like most wars, unfortunately, a post-war economy with a lot of unemployment, real high cost of living, and the 4 million veterans who returned home had no jobs.
Plus, 1917 Russia. You had the revolution. You had a lot of activity, and we all know about Sacco and Vanzetti later in the 20s, but you had a lot of activity among the, quote, anarchists and subversives, and some of it was true, and some of it was just wild speculation and rumor, I guess.
Yeah. What happened was that after the Russian Revolution in 1917, that movement came with a wave of immigrants that were coming from Europe at the time. Russians, Italians, East Europeans, and whatnot, and they brought that movement with them. Plus, it was just a general, movement within the labor movement itself. I mean, the Irish, James Connolly and James Larkin. I mean, they were socialist. So there was a lot of that going on, the undercurrent amongst all the other stuff, so to speak, that was going on at the time.
Do you think your role in law enforcement, obviously the subject matter is close to you, but do you think it also made you a better writer to get inside these characters, to feel what they were feeling, particularly Willie, who's the hero, if you will call him that, the young cop? I mean, does that sort of parallel your life experience?
Yeah, I think what I tried to do is I try to give a cop's point of view when I'm dealing with the police characters. That while they did what they were supposed to do, and while they enforced the laws and kept the peace and so on and so forth, they were human beings with families and whatnot, and families that they were away from a lot because of the barrack system they were living under, and so I think I try to show them as having the ordinary issues that every human being would have, plus these other political and labor issues.
Right. And the country opinion of the country was, this is terrible. They're supposed to be in service to the community, and this is an affront and a terrible, terrible trend. But did it spread? In other words, were there other police departments after or during that looked at this and said, we can try this too. We demand justice?
Well, I think, before then there were, actually London had a police strike just before the Boston police walked out. And unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at it, it wasn't successful either. I think there's an understanding in society that as bad as things can get for the police as workers, they are considered the last defense, and there is a line that they don't, as society, they don't expect them to cross.
I can imagine if you were a copper back then in 1919 September, and you walk the picket line, so to speak, the inner struggle when seeing somebody pick up a brick and throw it through a window. I mean, what do you do?
Right.
You're a cop, but you're not really a cop, and you're out of uniform at that time. In fact, you mentioned at some point they collected all the billy clubs, right?
Yes.
And the guns, or what they thought they collected. I mean, that's the way it worked. Billy club was a very effective tool back then.
It was. Yeah, they would carry both a billy club and in some cases a baton, also for the riot conditions. But billy club was used quite a bit.
Have you thought about not necessarily a follow up to this, but another era to write about? Are you going to continue in the historical fiction vein, you think?
I am. I've actually done some research for another novel, which is going to take place later in the late 50s, early 60s, an entirely different set of circumstances, but related to the history of the time.
Would it involve police, do you think?
I think it will have
Probably.
to, because I think that's going to be my niche.
I think more and more people like me, and I think a lot of people follow this, love to read about periods that are not often written about, because it opens up a whole new world. I mean, I'm a huge Civil War fan and read about World War II and all that, but World War I, still mystery to a lot of folks. And this period after the war, people just think, oh, the 20s, roaring 20s, and then the Depression. But, man, there's a lot going on, as evidenced by your book and things like Boardwalk Empire.
Yeah.
So, well, listen, Jim, can't thank you enough. There is a website, obviously, The Rising at roxburycrossing.com. And for those outside of the city, Roxbury is Roxbury. Have you been back to the old neighborhood? It's a little different now, isn't it?
It is. Actually, Roxbury Crossing doesn't really exist any longer. But I do. I go back quite often. I actually have a very good friend of mine who's a priest up at Mission Church where we used to play baseball together when we were kids. So,
Wow.
Yeah, I make it back quite often.
Well, congratulations on your first novel, writing a novel in your late teens, later years.
That's right.
And you've done a great job. I loved it, so I will hope our readers pick it up. It's called The Rising at Roxbury Crossing, a novel historically based by James Redfearn, Redfearn. And again, the website for details is therising at roxburycrossing.com. Thanks, Jim.
My pleasure.
Okay, we'll come back much more straight ahead on The Jordan Rich Show.